Now that we've created our WPF application and connected to Firebase, let's get into implementing some authentication use cases. So the first thing a user is going to have to do is register. So what we're going to do here is create some kind of registration form, and when the user submits that form, it's going to register them with Firebase Authentication. So as I mentioned last time, this is going to be an MVVM application. So that being said, let's create some folders here. One for our views that we're going to build out with XAML, of course, and our view models that are going to have the logic and data for the views. And then not sure if we'll need any models yet. Let's just focus on the UI for now. So starting with UI, let's create our view. This is going to be a user control. That's typically what we use to build out views in WPF. And we'll call this the register view. And before we even get into creating the view model, let's go ahead and actually implement this view. So this root grid, we're going to have two row definitions. Let's define our row definitions here. They can just have height of auto. That should be good. So they'll just fill up as much space as they need. And the first row, we're just going to have a header that says register. So let's add that. So the text is going to be register. And it's going to be kind of big. Let's make it, we'll go with 32. I'm probably going to guess a lot on this initial implementation. And then when we get to debugging this, we can do some live editing and just change stuff around with like margins and sizes. But anyways, this header, this will go in grid row 0. And then underneath this, we're going to have another grid. So this is going to go in grid row 1. And this is going to have all the form content. So let's create rows for all of our fields that we want in the form. So we're going to have a row definition for the user's email. We can just give these all a height auto, as well as their username, as well as a password field and a confirm password field. And then we're also going to have another row for some submit actions. So we're going to have a submit button to actually submit the registration. And then underneath that, we're going to have another row with a button that'll take them to a login screen if they already have an account. So it'll say something like, do you already have an account? Then click here and you'll go to the login page. So altogether, we're going to have 6 rows here. So this first row, it's going to be a stack panel, and this is going to represent the email input. And I'm putting this in a stack panel because I want to have a text box to actually input the email, as well as a label to describe this text box as the email field. So that label is going to go on top. So we can just have a text block, and the text will be email. And then underneath this, we'll have a text box. And I think we can just leave this blank for now with no properties or anything. We'll come back and change that up later. But this is going in grid row 0. And then let's add these for the other fields. So this will be username. And this is grid row 1. And then 2 more. Let's add these to their respective grid rows. So this is going to be password and confirm password. And then finally, we're going to have a button. And the content for this is going to be submit. So this is going to be submitting the registration for the new user. And this will go in grid row 4. And then finally, underneath that, we'll have a button that says something like already have an account, log in. And then clicking this will take them to the login form, which we'll implement in the future. So this pretty much describes the structure that we want on our UI, but there's still some things we need to change. So for one, these password fields shouldn't be text boxes, they should be password boxes. So there actually is a built-in password box control in WPF, but the issue with this control is that you can't bind the password to the view model. So our view model wouldn't know what the password is that the user typed. We wouldn't be able to bind to it. So I actually have a helper package with a bindable password box. So we can go to manage new packages and we can search for password box MVVM by Singleton Sean. And this is a password box that allows binding. So I actually have a video where I created this. So I'll leave a card for that or a link in the description. And you can also check out the source code if you wish. But let's install this. And now back in our register view, that package exposes a control. I believe it's called bindable password box. So here we go. We can import that from our password box MVVM package. And I accidentally did this for the username field, but I just want this for the password field and confirm password. So this can Go back to being a text box up here for username. So we got our register view. Let's go up to our main window and put this in our Windows grid so we actually see it in the UI. So let's get the register view in here, and we're gonna have to import that from our views namespace. And now when we run this, we'll see our views. So let's see what this looks like. All right, so as expected, it looks pretty bad, but hey, we got all the elements we need. We just need to move them around and space them out to actually look good. So the first thing I want to do is add some margin around everything. So let's add some margin to this root grid. We'll do 25. That should look better already. There we go. And then I want some margin between this header and this form. So let's add some margin to the top here. So we'll do maybe 20 to the top between our form and our header. That looks good. And then I don't think I want margin between this label and the actual text boxes and password boxes. I like them being close. But let's add some margin between each of the form inputs. So we can probably just do maybe only 5. Let's see how that looks. That looks good. I think 5 is enough. Let's see how 10 looks. I like 10 better. So let's do 10 margin between all of our form inputs. So password and confirm password 2. That looks good. And then let's add some margin on these buttons. So let's try 10 there too. I think we want more for that. Let's do 20 and see how that looks. That looks good to me. And then finally, this last button. So the button to navigate to the login page. Let's do margin there. We can probably just do 10. And I think that looks good. So I think the next thing I want to do is add some padding on these text boxes and password boxes. So we can actually do this in our app.xaml because I want these styles to be global. So inside here, we can have a style targeting text boxes. And I think all I really want to do is set some padding. So let's set the padding and maybe something small like 2. Let's see how that looks. So there we go. That looks good. And then of course, I'm going to want to do the same thing for the password boxes. So let's copy this style and do the same thing for bindable password box, which we're going to have to import the namespace for. So let's actually grab that from our register view. So we'll grab this components namespace, paste that into our app.xaml, and then reference that namespace to get our bindable password box. And it looks like the padding doesn't get applied. And I was just debugging this, but it turns out that we don't really have to reference bindable password box here. We can just reference password box, and then we wouldn't need this namespace either. But the reason we can do this is because the bindable password box component uses a password box, so we can actually just style the password box directly. And now if we look at this, there we go, we got our padding. So these form fields look good. Let's go ahead and style the buttons now. So maybe I just want a root button style. So let's do that. Let's add a style targeting buttons. And I think for now, all I really want is padding. We could have like a custom button style that actually looked good and didn't look like the plain Windows button. But we'll keep it simple for now. Let's just add padding. So we'll do 10 left and right and then 5 top and bottom. And let's see how that looks. That's good. I like that. And I actually kind of like this button being super wide and at the bottom. But I think what I want to do is make this form not take up the entire screen. So we can actually just set a max width on our register view. So maybe something like 500. Let's see. That looks good. And then last but not least, I think I want this already have an account login button to be transparent and be more like subtle text. So not really the main option. So we can just style this button directly. So let's add a style for this. And the reason I'm doing this style here is because I don't think this is going to be a style that we're going to use often in our application. But if we end up using it in other places, I'll be sure to extract it to a reusable style. But our target type here is buttons, of course. And let's set some things here. So I want the background to be transparent. Let's see how that looks. That's a step in the right direction. I also see our padding went away. So let's make sure we base this button style off of our existing button style. So we're going to base this off the default button style. And there we go. We get our padding back. I also don't want a border at all. So let's set the border thickness to 0. And I think this is good. Maybe it'd be cooler if this was more subtle and it didn't highlight all this. And maybe if the text was underlined, that'd be a little bit more subtle too. But I think overall, just for a registration form and demoing Firebase Authentication, this will be good enough, and it's not super ugly where it's going to hurt our eyes, and it'll get the job done. So that being said, we ultimately want this register view to hit Firebase Authentication whenever the user clicks submit. So we're going to need a view model to hook this view up to. So over in our view models folder, let's add a new view model. So this is going to be a class where you can just call it the register view model. And we're going to inherit from view model base. And this is important so that we get iNotify property changed from this base class. And it also provides a helper method so that we can raise iNotify property changed whenever a property changes. So in order to register with Firebase Authentication, we're going to need that data from our register view. So let's create properties that'll bind to these text boxes and password boxes and give us the data that we'll eventually use to register. So I'm going to use my prop change snippet. I'll leave a link to this in the description because it's a really helpful snippet to scaffold out a property that'll raise on property changed. And also, if you're not familiar with on property changed or iNotify property changed or any of this property change stuff I'm talking about, be sure to check out my MVVM Essentials video where I create the MVVM Essentials package and go over some of these features. But regardless, let's create this property. So this is going to be a string because it's going to be for the email that the user types in. And then let's create another property. This is going to be a string again for the username. And then another property. This one is going to be password for our password box. And then finally, the last property, you guessed it, is going to be a string for the confirm password box. So here we go. We got our 4 properties for our 4 fields in the UI. The next thing we need is commands that we can pass to our submit button and our navigate to login button that'll execute those respective actions. So we're going to have another property here, going to be an I command. So commands are what we pass to WPF buttons to execute some kind of behavior in MVVM applications. So this first button is going to be the submit command, and we can make this read only because we'll initialize it in the constructor. But this command is going to be passed to the submit button. And then we're going to have another command. We'll call it the navigate login command. And this is going to get passed to this already have an account button and take the user to the login page. And we'll create these commands in a bit. But right now we have the model for our view, the view model. And now we can bind all of these properties to our view so that our view is officially hooked up to our view model. So back in our view, let's start off with this text box. So the text for this text box is going to be a binding to the email property on our register view model. And while we're here, we'll also set the update source trigger to property changed. So what this does is it'll send the text of this text box to the view model immediately. So as the user is typing, this property will get updated. As opposed to the default, I think it'll get updated whenever the user leaves the text box. So let's also bind the username property. So this is going to be a binding to username. And let's also add a binding for password. So this is not a text property, it's the password property. And we want to bind to password. And then finally, let's also set this binding for confirm password. So let's specify that property name there. So it should be good with our text input bindings. Now moving down to these buttons. So the command for the submit button is going to be the submit command that we have on our view model down here. And then finally, this navigate to login button, the command here is going to be our navigate login command. And with that, our view will be able to connect to our view model completely. But the only way our view is going to be able to bind to these properties is if the data context of this view is a register view model. So what we need to do is head up to our app.xaml.cs and let's set the data context of our main window to a new register view model. So let's initialize that here. Right now it takes in no parameters. And the reason I'm doing this here rather than like putting our register view model in dependency injection is because I imagine all of this is going to change once we get into implementing navigation, and multiple views. But for now, this will get the job done. So just to summarize, our main window, if we come over to this, has a data context now of a register view model, which means our register view is going to inherit that data context and also have a data context of the register view model, which means it'll be able to connect to all of these properties. So to prove that, let's put a breakpoint on some of these setters. So we can just put one on email, and let's run this, and we should see the property get set whenever we change it. So let's just put some kind of random stuff there, and there we go. We passed the value to our view model. And I should also make sure that this works for the passwords too. So let's put a breakpoint on password and change that. And there we go. The password gets passed to the view model. So now we got our view and we got our view model, but we still have to implement these commands. So let's start off with the submit command, because this is arguably the most important to this series. And this is where we're going to actually interface with Firebase Authentication. So let's create a new commands folder in our project for all of our commands. And let's add a new command here. So a new item, it'll be a class. And I think we can just call this the register command. And this can inherit from async command base. So that's in our MVVM Essentials package. Again, if you want to see the contents of async command base, check out the MVVM Essentials video or check out the source code. But let's import that and let's implement this abstract async command base class. And by doing that, all we have to do is implement this execute method. And all of this is what's going to get executed whenever we click the button that this command is binded to. So this register command, of course, is responsible for registering the user, but it's going to have to do two things. So it's going to have to grab all the data that the user put into the view, which ultimately will be stored in the view model. And then it's going to have to use this Firebase Auth provider in order to hit Firebase Authentication and register the user. So let's get the two things we'll need here. So of course, we're going to have to grab the data that the user put in. That'll be in the register view model. And then we're also going to need the Firebase Auth provider so that we can register the user with Firebase Authentication. And we're going to get both of these things passed through the constructor. Let's import the stuff we need and then generate this constructor. So now that we got the data and the services we need, let's get into implementing this execute method. So the first thing we're going to have to do is check if the password and confirm password match on the UI. That's just a little check that's typically done with registration forms. So let's do that here. Let's actually get those properties into variables here. So the password will grab off the view model as well as the confirm password. So if the password does not equal the confirm password, then we'll just return early. And it wants us to return a task. Let's make this method async. So knows we don't actually want to return anything. But if the passwords do match, we can go ahead and register. So let's take the Firebase Auth provider and let's use create user with email and password async in order to register. So we can grab the email off of our register view model as well as the password. We actually already have that in a variable, and then the display name, so we can grab that off the register view model. That's actually just the username. And there's other options here like sending a verification email, but I think we'll just leave that as the default of false. And then if this fails, it'll actually throw an exception. So let's wrap that in a try catch just so that we know that it will throw. But right now we'll just leave it unhandled, so we'll just throw again. And basically all we have right now is the happy path. So if the passwords don't match, we don't do anything. And then if registration fails, then we also don't do anything. But this should be enough just to test and make sure that this works. So let's get back to hooking this up. So in our register view model, let's initialize this submit command. So this will be a new register command. And let's import that from our command namespace. And that'll take in this view model instance as well as the Firebase Auth provider. So let's get this auth provider passed through the constructor so we can generate a constructor parameter for that. Let's just import the namespace. And now back in our app.xaml.cs, we're going to have to pass in that auth provider. So we actually can resolve that from our service provider that we have in this callback. So we can take our services and get required service and we want the Firebase auth provider, which we have already registered. So we should be good to test this out. Again, we just have the happy path, but let's put a breakpoint in our register command and run this. And before I submit this form, let me show you our project. So right now we have no users, but let's submit the form and then see what happens. So let's add an email. We can do test@gmail.com. My username will be Singleton Sean. My password will be test123 exclamation point. And let's put that in confirm password too. So let's submit, and password and confirm password did not match. And when that happens, we don't do anything. So we're gonna have to handle that, but let's make these match and try again. So here we go, they matched, and now we're gonna hit Firebase. Let's see, let me make sure we don't throw an exception. Let's continue, and we did not throw an exception. Let's come back over to Firebase and refresh, and there we go, our user was created successfully. So if I try and submit again, I think we'll actually get the exception, which we do, and this is because the email already exists. And when that happens, we don't actually do anything or handle the exception. We're just left on the form. And same for if we register successfully, we're just left on the form, which isn't really ideal. So really what I would want to do after a successful registration is navigate to login, which we can't really do right now because we haven't set up navigation infrastructure, and we also don't have a login view yet. So next time we'll implement that. Now back on the topic of our register view, I would like to make it styled really nice and add some front-end validation logic, and then maybe some loading spinners and loading logic. But I think for now, all I'm going to do is add message boxes for some of these edge cases. So whenever password and confirm password don't match, we'll do a message box dot show, and we'll say password and confirm password must match. Our caption will just be error. Our message box button will be okay, so they just kind of have to accept. And then our image will be error. And then we're also going to show an error message box whenever we catch an exception for registration failing. We'll just say registration failed. Please try again later. And then if registration was successful, we'll also show a message box. So we'll just say successfully registered, and we'll make the caption success. And the message box image can be information. And then lastly, since we're handling this exception, we don't want to throw anymore. So let's try this out. Let's submit with nothing, and we get registration failed. That's good. Let's try putting in some data. So we'll do an email that already exists, and we'll just do some random passwords that match, and we get registration failed. Please try again later. Although this isn't really a good error message, maybe we'll come back to that in a second. But let's get a successful registration. Oh, it failed. Maybe our password's not long enough. Let's do test123 exclamation point. Let's try that. And that's kind of the problem with these error messages, is it doesn't tell you what's wrong. So we should definitely address that in the future. But there we go, longer password was successful. And now if these don't match, we also get an error message that they should match. So I guess one thing with this error message, since we're not handling specific errors, we should say, please check your information or try again later. Anyways, regardless, this should be good enough for now. At least we're providing feedback. But down the road, we should definitely improve this error handling. So again, this is the most we can do with the register view because we don't have a login view yet. So we can't implement the navigation to the login view, such as after submitting or whenever executing this navigate login command. So next time we are going to implement the login view. But before we wrap up here, I want to implement some navigation infrastructure so that we can just jump right into the login view next time. So to implement navigation, our MVVM Essentials package that we've been using quite a lot actually provides some navigation infrastructure. So the first piece of navigation from that package, and probably the most important, is the navigation store. So we can register this navigation store in dependency injection. We want it as a singleton because the purpose of the navigation store is to control which view our application should show. So we should really only have one of these in our entire application. So that's the navigation store, and we're importing that from MVVM Essentials. And then the second piece for navigation is the main view model. So this main view model uses the navigation store and controls which view to display in the UI. So this should also be a singleton because we're only going to have one main view model for our one main window. So let's add this main view model. Let's import that from MVVM Essentials. And then finally, the main view model is going to be the data context for the main window. So we can resolve that main view model from dependency injection. So get required service, and we want the main view model. And let me actually check, does our main view model need anything else? So it also needs a modal navigation store in case we want to do modal navigation. So let's register that in dependency injection too. So the modal navigation store, but I don't think we're going to be doing anything with modals in this series. So let's run this and make sure everything gets resolved, which it does. But as we can see, our bindings are actually broken right now because our data context is no longer our register view model. So we need to make some adjustments in our main window because the data context here is now a main view model. So instead of this register view, we're going to have a content control. And the content that we display in here is going to be a binding to the current view model. So current view model is a property on main view model. So we look at this. Here we go. We got current view model. And that just points to the current view model that's on that navigation store for our app. So based on that, what we need to do is set the current view model to be the register view model. And then that'll be displayed when we enter the application. So in order to set that current view model on the navigation store, we can use a navigation service for that. So that's part of the MVVM Essentials too. So we can add that as a singleton, and this will be a navigation service imported from MVVM Essentials. And this is generic, so it takes the view model that we want to navigate to. We're going to navigate to the register view model. So let's register that with a function that takes our service provider, because we're going to have to get some services from dependency injection. So we'll instantiate the navigation service. Let me move this to new lines. But we're going to have to pass in our navigation store. So let's resolve that from dependency injection. So our navigation store. And then second part of this navigation service is a delegate that I call create view model. So this is the function that'll take in no parameters and return a register view model. So we can create that function here. So it takes in no parameters and returns a register view model. And this register view model will need our Firebase auth provider, which we can get from dependency injection. So let's get that Firebase auth provider. And there we go. This was kind of complex, but we registered our navigation service for our register view model, and we registered that with a callback so that we could access our service provider. We had to get our navigation store from services, as well as create a callback that'll create the register view model that we want to navigate to. So now that we have that navigation service, we can call navigate when our application starts. So let's resolve that navigation service from dependency injection. So we get our host services, and we want to get the navigation service for the register view model. So let's resolve that. And this is just an I navigation service. And we can simply call navigate on the navigation service, which will set the current view model for the application. So if we run this, let's see what we get. So there we go. We set the current view model for the app to our register view model, but this is not what we wanted to show. So the last thing we have to do is map our register view model to a register view. So basically, whenever we get a register view model, we want to display the register view. So that'll take place in this content control. So we can set the content control resources. So set the resources here. And inside here, we just want to have data templates that map our view models to views. So this data template, the data type for this is going to be our register view model. So we're going to need our view models namespace in here, and we can just call this view models, or how about just VMs. So the data type for this data template is going to be our register view model, and we want to map this to our register view. And now when we start our app, we should get our register view displayed, and we get no binding errors. So if I submit, we should see our command execute, and there we go, we just get our error message right now. But if we filled this all in, then we'd be able to register. So that was a lot just setting up our WPF infrastructure, but let's summarize what we did. So we started off with the UI, so we created our register view. So we got our header, and then our form, and then our submit button, and then a button that we'll implement later that'll navigate us to the login page. We also had to install a package that we could bind to password boxes because default WPF password boxes don't allow that. After we implemented the view, we implemented our view model. So this has properties that we can bind to in order to get data from our UI, as well as commands that we hook up to our buttons to execute some actions whenever those buttons are clicked. So we added this submit command that is just a register command. So whenever that command is executed, we execute this registration logic. We check the password to make sure it matches confirm password. If it doesn't, we just show this ugly message box, which hopefully we can improve on in the future and show something that's more elegant rather than an ugly message box. But if they do match, then we hit Firebase Authentication and register the new user and show message boxes for them being successfully registered. And if it fails, then we show a message box for the failure. We could handle these exceptions better and actually figure out what went wrong. But then lastly, we set up navigation so that next time we can hop right into implementing our login view. So to do that, we had to add some services. We needed a navigation store and a modal navigation store, as well as our main view model. So now our main window binds to a main view model, and this has a current view model that it gets from the navigation store. And our main window takes this current view model and displays it on the UI in a content control, which we map to the corresponding view. And then finally, we navigate on application startup using this navigation service. So this service sets the current view model on the navigation store so that our main window can show the view that we want. So aside from the Firebase stuff, this was a lot of WPF concepts covered in this video. So be sure to check out the MVVM Essentials video to see what's inside of that package that we used a lot and understand some of the essential pieces of WPF MVVM architecture. And for some of this navigation stuff, this was kind of complex too. So I have a whole series on navigation that you can check out in order to wrap your head around WPF navigation because it is somewhat complex. Anyways, hopefully you can apply these concepts to your own application in order to build out registration UIs and allow users to register via Firebase Authentication. If you have any questions, criticisms, or concerns, be sure to leave those below in the comments section. If you enjoyed the video or are enjoying the channel, consider becoming a member. Other than that, leave a like or subscribe for more. Thank you.